The water bottle Emily had just purchased was still cold, beads of condensation clinging to the plastic like it had only just left the cooler. Her silver Toyota Corolla sat abandoned on the shoulder of Interstate 90, headlights burning into the night. The driver's door left slightly ajar as if someone had stepped out in a hurry. Inside, her purse, untouched. Her phone, neatly resting on the passenger seat. Keys in the ignition. A scene frozen in time, yet Emily Hartman herself was gone. It was August 24th, 2005, a late summer evening in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The air carried that heavy mix of heat and cornfield wind drifting from the Big Sioux River. At 9:12 p.m., Emily had called her mother, her voice calm, promising she'd be home in half an hour. At 9:30, a gas station camera captured her walking in, hair tied back, dressed in a light t-shirt, buying nothing more than a cold bottle of water. She smiled politely at the cashier, turned, and walked into the darkness. Those were the last living images ever recorded of her. By 10:30, her parents found the car. The glow of its headlights cut through the stillness, but their daughter was nowhere to be found. The police arrived, but in those critical early hours, mistakes would bury the truth. Tire tracks left by a pickup truck behind her Corolla, a man's size 11 footprint pointing toward her door, and a phone signal that pulsed near the river. Evidence overlooked. A life vanishing between two highway mile markers. If you were driving that stretch of road tonight and saw a car idling alone with its headlights burning, would you slow down or would you keep going? Don't let stories like Emily's fade into the dark. Subscribe now and help keep the light shining on cold case files that deserve answers. After that fleeting moment on the highway's shoulder, the story rewinds to what had seemed like an utterly ordinary day. Emily Hartman was, by all accounts, a creature of routine. At just 20 years old, she balanced the heavy load of being a full-time sociology student at the University of South Dakota, with part-time hours at a small downtown coffee shop. She lived at home with her parents and younger sister, often helping with chores in the evenings, and was known for her almost meticulous attention to structure. Emily didn't stay out late. She didn't party recklessly. She was the kind of young woman whose absence would be noticed in an instant because she was always there, reliable, predictable, steady. On the afternoon of August 24th, 2005, she clocked in at the cafe a little after 2 o'clock. The day had been sweltering, nearly 95 degrees, and customers trickled in seeking iced lattes and cold sodas. Co-workers later recalled her easy laughter behind the counter, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and the way she hummed quietly when restocking napkins. Nothing seemed unusual. One colleague remembered she even joked about finally saving enough tips to buy a new pair of shoes for fall semester. When the clock struck 9, Emily hung up her apron, collected her faded blue backpack, and waved goodbye. Security cameras from nearby shops showed her walking across the parking lot, keys in hand, moving with a purposeful stride toward the silver Corolla her family had proudly helped her purchase earlier that spring. She was careful with that car, her first big responsibility. At exactly 9:12 p.m., just as the sun's last glow was fading, Emily dialed her mother from the driver's seat. The conversation lasted less than a minute. "I'll be home in about half an hour," she said, her voice light, casual, and steady. Her mom heard no tension, no fear, nothing that would have raised the smallest alarm. That was the last living phone call anyone would receive from Emily. From there, the timeline narrows like a funnel. At approximately 9:30, a grainy security camera at a Brandon gas station captured her, walking inside alone. She carried herself the same as always, neat, reserved, hair still perfectly tied. She placed a chilled water bottle on the counter, smiled politely at the cashier, and paid with cash. The clerk later said nothing about her felt unusual. She wasn't in a rush, wasn't nervous, just a young woman heading home at the end of a long, hot work day. She walked out the door, the glass reflecting a wash of fluorescent light behind her, and vanished into the rural darkness of Interstate 90. Ngoy, 2. You tell yourself routines keep you safe. Same drive, same stop, same call to your mom. But routines also make you visible, predictable to anyone who might be watching. If someone wanted to cross paths with Emily Hartman, all they had to do was wait. And so, the minutes after 9:30 would become the most scrutinized in Sioux Falls history. Investigators later pieced together that Emily's Corolla merged eastbound onto the interstate. Traffic that night was sparse, just the occasional long-haul truck and a handful of commuters. Somewhere between the gas station and her parents' driveway, those last 15 minutes became a void. Her family, however, was still living inside the comfort of expectation. At 10 o'clock, her mom glanced at the kitchen clock, certain she'd hear the creak of the front door any second. When 5 minutes passed, she dialed Emily's phone. It rang endlessly, then cut to silence. At 10:15, her mom called again. And again. The absence of an answer was louder than any scream. By 10:30, her father had grabbed his keys and driven the familiar route himself, headlights sweeping the asphalt with dread growing in his chest. When he reached that stretch of Interstate 90, his worst fears crystallized. Emily's Corolla sat on the shoulder, headlights still burning, driver's door ajar. The scene felt wrong, as if she had been plucked out of existence mid-motion. But in those precious early minutes, before police were called, before flashing lights turned the roadside into a stage, the day that began so ordinary had already slipped irretrievably into nightmare. From a sociological lens, Emily's disappearance highlights the fragility of the routines we trust. Psychologists call it the illusion of safety, the belief that repeating the same patterns shields us from danger. In reality, predictability can expose you to greater risk. The stranger who studies your path learns not just where you are, but when. And that night, someone was waiting. Her co-workers, when interviewed, would later weep as they replayed that last laugh, that casual wave. One of them recalled Emily confiding just weeks before that she sometimes felt followed after closing shifts. A car with unfamiliar headlights had once lingered behind her. She had brushed it off with nervous laughter, saying, "I'm probably just paranoid." Those words now sounded like foreshadowing carved in stone. The image of Emily leaving the cafe that evening, backpack over her shoulder, water bottle later sweating in the cup holder, would become burned into the community's memory. Friends asked each other, could we have noticed? Should we have warned her? What does it mean when the most ordinary day of your life becomes the last? By the time police arrived at 10:40, cordoning off the area with yellow tape, the questions had already taken root. And yet, the answers would not come for years. If this story moves you, help keep Emily's name alive. Comment below. Drop a 1 if you think this deserves to be remembered, a 0 if you believe we told it poorly. Every interaction keeps these cold case files in the public eye, where they belong. When officers finally reached the Corolla that night, the scene was at once hauntingly ordinary and profoundly unsettling. The car idled on the shoulder of Interstate 90, as if it had simply stalled, headlights still glowing against the prairie darkness, casting long shadows over the grass. The driver's door was slightly ajar, an invitation no one could explain. Inside, Emily's purse sat neatly on the passenger side floorboard, her wallet untouched. Her flip phone lay atop the seat, its battery still warm. In the cup holder, the condensation on the water bottle had not yet evaporated, proof that whatever had happened had taken place only minutes earlier. To seasoned investigators, these details should have screamed urgency. The untouched belongings suggested she had not planned to leave voluntarily. The ajar door implied a sudden interruption, an exit without preparation. Yet the atmosphere that night was tinged with hesitation, as though the responding officers weren't sure if they were witnessing a crime scene or simply the beginning of a missing person case. As flashlights swept the ground, 2 clues appeared that would later haunt the entire investigation. Just behind the Corolla's rear bumper, tire impressions were visible in the soft dirt. The tread was distinct, deeper and wider than a sedan's, suggesting a mid-size pickup had idled there. The spacing indicated the vehicle hadn't simply passed by. It had stopped, lingered. To the right of those tracks, on the grassy shoulder, a man's shoe print was clearly stamped in the soil. The size, approximately 11, was large enough to stand out, pointing directly toward the Corolla's driver's side door. No return print was visible. Whoever made it had approached, but not walked away. In hindsight, these were the red threads that could have unraveled the mystery. But in the chaos of that night, they were treated as minor details. The tire impressions were photographed but not cast in plaster. Within hours, some were overwritten by patrol vehicles, erasing any chance of later analysis. The shoe print was recorded with a camera but never preserved physically, making it nearly impossible to later determine the brand or model of shoe. Anguish, 2. If you had found your child's car like this, keys in the ignition, purse still inside, tire tracks pressed deep behind it, would you have believed no evidence of a crime? Or would every fiber of your being scream that something violent had just happened? For the Hartman family, watching from behind the yellow tape, the latter was undeniable. Emily's mother reportedly cried out, "Where's my daughter? Did someone take her?" But the answers she received were vague, designed more to calm than to clarify. She might have left on her own. "We'll find her," one officer told her. That reassurance, while perhaps well-intentioned, turned into the first fatal error. The scene was processed under the framework of a voluntary disappearance, not a criminal abduction. That distinction mattered. A missing person case often leads investigators to wait for the subject to return, to canvass friends, to search quietly. A criminal case demands immediate, airtight preservation of evidence, rapid canvassing of witnesses, and aggressive pursuit of leads. Emily's case began with the wrong lens, and that lens colored every decision made in those critical first 48 hours. Inside the Corolla, every detail told a story, if only someone had listened. The driver's seat was adjusted to Emily's petite frame, the radio tuned to her usual station. The backpack she carried from the cafe was slumped against the rear seat, zippers closed, contents untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no shattered glass, no blood. It was as though she had been plucked straight from the seat by invisible hands. Investigators logged these details, but their report concluded. No clear evidence of foul play. In that single line, the trajectory of the case bent toward silence. Tire tracks that should have been matched to vehicle databases were left in photographs only. The shoe print that could have been cast, compared, and tied to a suspect vanished into the dirt, washed away by the next rainfall. Meanwhile, Emily's father stood on the roadside in stunned disbelief, his hand gripping his wife's shoulder. In later journal entries, he wrote about staring at the Corolla's glowing headlights, hoping against hope that his daughter would reappear, walking out of the darkness. But instead of clarity, he watched as evidence was bagged in haste and the car was eventually towed away. "I felt like they were sealing her away from us," he wrote. Forensic best practices stress the importance of over-collecting rather than under-collecting. Every smudge, every fiber, every impression might prove valuable years later. Yet in Emily's case, the opposite happened. What little evidence existed was reduced, misfiled, or dismissed as insignificant. The decision to clear the scene after only a few hours compounded the error. Patrol vehicles inadvertently crush secondary tire marks that may have belonged to the pickup. Foot traffic blurred the grass where the shoe print lay. By dawn, the scene that could have spoken volumes had gone mute. In true crime analysis, these early errors are not just procedural failures, they become psychological ones. Families lose faith. Communities whisper about incompetence. And suspects, emboldened by the lack of urgency, slip deeper into shadows. Years later, when the case was reopened by a cold case unit, investigators would look back at these first hours with a mixture of frustration and grief. One retired officer admitted, "We had the signs right there. We just didn't treat it like what it was." 1. Don't let mistakes like this vanish into the dark. Hit like now to remind the world that following proper procedure in cold case files isn't optional. It's the difference between justice delayed and justice denied. The night pressed heavy over Sioux Falls, its late August heat lingering even as the clock neared midnight. Patrol cars lined Interstate 90, their rotating lights casting streaks of red and blue across the silver Corolla still idling on the shoulder. Officers had sealed the scene, but they knew time was slipping away. Every missing persons investigation carries a brutal truth. The first 48 hours are critical. Beyond that, hope begins to wither. And so, they mobilized. Floodlights were erected, turning a lonely patch of asphalt into a makeshift base of operations. Radios crackled with clipped voices, summoning canine units and arranging for aerial support. From the shadows, Emily's parents watched, clinging to each other, their eyes fixed on the car that still held their daughter's phone, her wallet, and that cold water bottle. To them, the objects were unbearable proof of absence. The first K9 team arrived before 1. 0A. M. Handlers knelt beside their German shepherds, presenting the dogs with a piece of Emily's clothing. The response was immediate. Tails stiffened, noses darted to the ground. Within seconds, the dogs lunged toward the grassy shoulder, pulling hard on their leashes. Officers followed closely, beams of flashlights bouncing across the darkness. The trail ran straight from the Corolla to the edge of the Big Sioux River. Barking echoed against the water, urgent and insistent. Handlers exchanged uneasy glances. Dogs trained for scent rarely lied. If you glimpsed a car on the shoulder tonight, headlights burning, door ajar, would you drive on and dismiss it as someone fixing a flat? Or would you stop? Would you dare to walk toward the riverbank, knowing the dogs had locked on to a human scent and then lost it? That is the line ordinary people often fear to cross, the moment when safety shatters into danger. At the water's edge, the K9s grew agitated. They circled, noses dipping to the current, then pulled back, confused. The scent trail ended abruptly, as if swallowed whole by the river. A handler muttered, "She was here. She came this far." Then silence fell except for the restless current slapping against the bank. By 2. 0 M. Helicopters lifted off from the small municipal airport nearby. Their rotors thumped through the night, searchlights combing the cornfields and tree lines. One chopper carried infrared scanners designed to detect body heat. From above, the fields glowed with ghostly outlines, searchers, patrol cars, scattered deer, but no trace of Emily. On the ground, volunteers began arriving. Word had spread fast through late-night phone calls and radio bulletins. Farmers, students, church members, ordinary citizens drawn by the desperate plea of a missing daughter, showed up with flashlights and sturdy boots. They lined up shoulder to shoulder, instructed to walk in sweeping rows across fields of corn and grass. It was grueling, slow work, but every step mattered. Comment line search if you've ever joined a search like this, side by side with strangers, every footstep scanning for a scrap of fabric, a glint of jewelry, a footprint half buried in the soil. For the Hartmans, every volunteer was a lifeline, proof their daughter was not forgotten. For the police, it was manpower they couldn't do without. For Emily, it was hope measured in footsteps. The heat refused to break. Even in the early hours, sweat beaded on foreheads and clothes clung to backs. Searchers swatted away mosquitoes rising from the wetlands by the river. Some carried sticks to push aside thick brush. Others tied scarves across their mouths against the dust. And still, nothing appeared. Not a scrap of fabric, not a shoe, not a sign of struggle beyond the tire marks and that solitary shoe print now fading in memory. Helicopters circled until fuel ran low. Infrared scans revealed only the restless movements of the living. The river gave up no secrets. Searchers on boats dragged spotlights across the current, illuminating only foam and reeds. Volunteer divers slipped into the dark water, bubbles rising to the surface. They searched blind, hands sweeping the riverbed. When they resurfaced, their expressions were grim. Nothing. By dawn, the horizon glowed faint orange. The second day began with a larger search perimeter, 1 mile, then 3, then 5. Volunteers walked again, weary but resolute. Maps were sketched across patrol car hoods, marking which fields were cleared, which barns inspected, which roadsides still untouched. Reporters arrived, cameras rolling, broadcasting Emily's face to every living room in South Dakota. A young woman vanished, the anchors said. Last seen at a gas station. Her car found abandoned. But television could not capture the quiet devastation at the scene, the way Emily's mother leaned against her husband, whispering prayers, or the way her younger sister stood silently, her eyes swollen from tears but refusing to leave. If you had found your child's car like this, one veteran officer whispered under his breath as he walked the bank again. The thought was unbearable, yet it was the reality pressed upon the Hartmans. They were no longer just parents, they had become unwilling soldiers in a war for answers. By the end of the second day, exhaustion weighed on everyone. The river had revealed nothing. The fields gave no trace. And yet, the image of those canines barking at the water lingered in every investigator's mind. Something had happened there. Something final. But without a body, without new evidence, the case hung in limbo. All they had was silence, and silence is the cruelest evidence of all. By the third day of Emily's disappearance, the relentless search along the river and fields had yielded nothing concrete. Exhaustion and frustration weighed heavily on investigators. They turned back to what little data they had. The timeline between the coffee shop, the phone call to her mother, and the Brandon gas station camera, the last time Emily was seen alive. The gas station security system, old and grainy, wasn't designed for solving crimes. But for the Hartman family, it became a sacred fragment of their daughter's final movements. At 9:30 p.m., the blurry footage captured Emily pushing open the glass door, her hair tied neatly back, her t-shirt plain and light in color. She smiled faintly at the cashier, bought a bottle of water, and walked back out into the night. Those 42 seconds of tape became the last living record of her existence. Investigators studied every frame. Did anyone follow her in? Did she glance over her shoulder? Was there any sign of fear? Nothing. She looked calm, alone, ordinary. Yet, within minutes, she would vanish from the highway. If you had watched that tape in real time, seen a young woman moving through her routine, would you have recognized it as a final chapter? Or would you, like the cashier, dismiss it as another nameless night? That is the cruelty of hindsight. Ordinary images become haunting when viewed through the lens of tragedy. Outside, The gas station's parking lot camera caught only a glimpse of headlights pulling away, merging onto Interstate 90. Beyond that, nothing. In 2005, South Dakota's surveillance infrastructure was minimal. Most highways had no cameras at all. Those gaps, those blind spots, became open doors through which both Emily and her abductor disappeared. Then came the first break, or what should have been. A long-haul truck driver named Mark Ellison came forward. On the night of August 24th, around 10, p.m., he had been driving eastbound when something caught his eye. A silver Toyota Corolla parked on the shoulder with a dark green pickup truck idling right behind it. He thought little of it at the time. Cars stop along the highway all the time, sometimes for a flat tire, sometimes for a quick rest. But in retrospect, that image branded itself into his memory. When he reported it to police, it should have been gold. A silver Corolla matched Emily's car. A green pickup? That could be the missing link. But the details weren't logged properly. His statement was filed as vague, unverified. A note that should have read possible suspect vehicle was buried under bureaucratic clutter. Even worse, when Ellison tried to recall part of the license plate, he believed it began with 47 or 74 and ended in a D. The officer misrecorded it. In the official system, it was listed simply as unreadable. Eights. That clerical error cost nearly a decade. By the time the cold case unit revisited Ellison's words in 2012, thousands of records had expired or been purged. What might have been traced in days became a haystack with no needle. Imagine being Emily's parents, years later, learning that a witness had seen a truck behind her car and that police had not pursued it with urgency. If you were in their place, could you forgive that oversight? Or would you replay it in your mind, night after night, imagining how differently things might have ended? Ellison's testimony wasn't the only sign pointing toward that pickup. Another resident living near Interstate 90 reported hearing an engine stop and start around the same time, headlights flaring briefly in the darkness before fading into the distance. Police logged it, then dismissed it for lack of corroboration. Like so many early details, it was reduced to a line in a report that no one read twice. The tragedy of Emily Hartman's investigation wasn't just in what was found, but in what was ignored. The pickup truck could have been tracked. License plates could have been cross-referenced. Tire treads could have been matched. But each step was delayed, minimized, or set aside. And in cold cases, every delay is fatal. This is why awareness matters. Every viewer who shares stories like Emily's keeps the mistakes from being buried. When people understand how fragile investigations can be, they pressure institutions to do better. Share this story to increase awareness for cold case files, because every overlooked detail can mean the difference between justice and silence. As days turned into weeks, the green pickup became a ghost. It haunted the margins of the case, whispered in police reports and community gossip, but never substantiated. Some said it was a Ford. Others swore it was a Chevy. But no one could prove which, and without a plate number, the lead went cold. For the Hartmans, this was unbearable. Emily's father wrote in his journal, "Someone saw her that night. Someone saw a truck. And yet, nothing was done. I will never stop thinking about that truck." His words were bitter, but true. In many ways, the case lived and died with that vehicle. By the fall of 2005, the momentum had collapsed. His searches dwindled. Volunteers returned to their lives. The Corolla was towed, inspected, and released. And the green pickup, so tantalizing, so specific, was left in the shadows. But shadows don't stay forever. In time, as forensic science advanced and fresh eyes revisited the files, that forgotten witness statement would resurface. And when it did, it would drag the case back into the light. For now, though, the truck was just a phantom haunting Interstate 90, another piece of evidence lost to neglect. And for Emily's family, each missed chance was another knife to the heart, another night staring into the dark, wondering if justice had been permanently stolen. By the end of the first week, investigators turned to what remained of Emily's digital trail. In 2005, cell phone technology was nowhere near as advanced as it is today, but it could still provide a crucial thread. Emily's last call to her mother at 9:12 p.m. had been logged cleanly. After that, silence. Yet the phone itself had continued to communicate with nearby towers for a brief period after she vanished. Technicians retrieved the records and made a chilling discovery. The final ping placed her phone near the Big Sioux River, within a narrow range just miles from where her Corolla had been discovered. It was a breadcrumb, a flashing arrow pointing investigators back to the very area where the canines had barked and stopped short. For Emily's parents, the revelation was agonizing. They stood by the water's edge as officers explained what the data meant. Their daughter's phone had been there. Maybe she had too. And if the phone had fallen into the river, or been thrown there, it might still hold answers, messages, call logs, even fingerprints. But all of that depended on whether the device could be recovered. That is where the fracture in the investigation widened into a canyon. The local rescue team recommended deploying sonar technology to scan the riverbed. Even in 2005, side-scan sonar could detect small objects underwater, especially in shallow currents like the Big Sioux. The technology wasn't perfect, but it was possible. A phone, a piece of clothing, or even disturbed soil could have been identified. But the police hesitated. The official reasoning: the currents were strong, the weather unpredictable, and the equipment costly. Resources, they said, had to be allocated carefully. Instead of launching an extensive sonar sweep, only a few divers were sent down in quick sessions, sweeping with flashlights in their hands in murky water. Nothing turned up. The phone remained missing, and with it, the chance to capture critical evidence from the night Emily vanished. If a single scan could have changed this story, wouldn't you demand it? Wouldn't you stand on that riverbank and beg them to lower the sonar, to give you even the faintest hope of recovering your child's last link to life? That is what the Hartmans did. They pleaded, but their pleas were met with shrugs and paperwork. The file was eventually updated with a cold line: device unrecoverable, presumed lost in water. That conclusion sealed the evidence away, not because the truth wasn't there, but because no one insisted on digging deeper. For the Hartmans, it was another knife twist. Emily's father, with some technical knowledge, asked why they didn't at least attempt a full sonar grid. He received only vague answers about budget constraints. He later wrote in his journal, "They tell me it's too hard, too expensive. But no expense is greater than a daughter's life. They've closed the door on us." 8. Comment, keep looking if you believe cold case files deserve every ounce of effort, every tool, every scan. Because sometimes, one overlooked detail can bury the truth for decades. Meanwhile, the search for Emily drifted further off course. Media reports covered the sonar debate but soon lost steam, shifting focus to newer crimes. The community, still shaken, kept asking about the phone. Where did it go? Why wasn't it found? Those questions echoed louder than answers. Inside the police department, the decision not to deploy sonar thoroughly became a quiet shame. Younger investigators whispered about it, some openly frustrated that such a vital step had been skipped. "If we had found that phone," one later admitted, "we might have cracked this case before it ever went cold." 8. Instead, the missed opportunity became another entry in the growing list of investigative failures. The tire tracks left uncast. The shoe print photographed but not preserved. The truck driver's license plate misfiled. And now, the phone ping ignored, its potential loss to the currents of the Big Sioux. For the Hartman family, every drive past the river became torment. They could not look at its calm surface without seeing secrets beneath. To them, it wasn't just water, it was a graveyard of evidence, a place where answers had been allowed to sink. Years later, when Emily's remains would be found along the very same riverbank, the bitterness of that 2005 decision would resurface with cutting force. The phone might have been there. The truth might have been there. But no one looked long enough. As the investigation faltered, tips trickled in, anonymous letters, supposed sightings, but none carried the weight of that ping. The digital voice of Emily's phone had spoken one last time, pointing to the river. But instead of following it fully, the investigators turned away. And so, another chance at justice was lost. As months passed with no progress, the momentum behind Emily's case began to falter. By early 2006, the posters that once covered shop windows and church bulletin boards curled at the edges. The nightly news reports shrank from headline coverage to brief updates. And the Hartman family was left clinging to the fading hope that each new phone call might bring answers. But instead of clarity, what came were distractions, false tips that led nowhere. An anonymous letter arrived at the police station, claiming Emily was alive in Minneapolis, starting a new life. Investigators spent 3 weeks chasing the claim, knocking on doors and scouring surveillance tapes, only to confirm it was a hoax. For the Hartmans, the experience was cruel. "People are toying with our pain," Emily's father told reporters, his voice raw. "If you've ever waited by a phone, hoping for good news, only to feel it dissolve into nothing, then you know the ache they carried." Each false lead was a new wound, and yet the family couldn't turn away. What if, just once, the tip had been true? In 2007, another wave of hope surfaced when a group of teenagers fishing at Wall Lake, 20 miles from Sioux Falls, discovered a woman's shoe floating near the shore. It matched the style Emily often wore at the coffee shop. The news jolted the community, and for a moment, Wall Lake became the epicenter of speculation. Divers combed the murky water. The Hartman father stood on the shore for 3 days, refusing to leave until DNA results came back. But the verdict crushed them once again. The shoe wasn't Emily's. It was just debris, lost years earlier. The mother collapsed into tears at a press conference, while her husband held her up, silent and trembling. Each false lead carried not just disappointment, but humiliation, a sense of being pulled into a cruel cycle of hope and despair. By 2008, the pattern was tragically familiar. A supposed sighting of a young woman at a bus stop in Sioux City. A report of a pickup truck stopping late at night near a farmhouse. Each story promised a thread, but each unraveled into nothing. The police chased them with limited resources, while the real evidence, those tire tracks, that shoe print, the phone ping, sat dormant in the file. For the community, Emily's case slowly transformed from urgent crisis to whispered cautionary tale. Parents warned daughters not to drive alone late at night. Young women carried pepper spray and locked doors more tightly. But in the official records, progress had stalled. By 2009, the blow became official. The Hartman file was labeled a cold case. It was a bureaucratic phrase, but for the family, it felt like a death sentence. It meant the searchlights were shut off, the K-9s retired, the divers sent home. Their daughter's name now sat in a metal cabinet, boxed alongside dozens of other unsolved tragedies. Emily's mother wept openly during the announcement. "Closing a file doesn't mean closing her life," she said. It means you've abandoned her. Her husband turned away from cameras, unwilling to speak, his silence heavier than words. For viewers, this is where persistence matters most. When cases fade from headlines, they risk being forgotten forever. Stay through to the end. Long watch time pushes cold case files to more viewers, and more viewers mean more pressure for justice. The years 2006 to 2009 were defined not by discovery, but by neglect. And yet, the Hartman family never stopped writing letters, never stopped praying at vigils, never stopped demanding answers. Their persistence would one day matter. But for now, Emily's name was buried under dust and silence, waiting for science and time to breathe life back into the case. For more than a decade, Emily's case sat frozen, sealed in a cabinet, reduced to whispers of unsolved. But in March 2020, fate stirred along the banks of the Big Sioux River. A farmer in Lincoln County, clearing a patch of overgrown land to expand grazing space, spotted something pale protruding from the churned soil. At first, he assumed it was a piece of driftwood or perhaps an animal bone. But when he bent down, brushing dirt away with calloused hands, the shape struck him cold. It was unmistakably human, a skull, weathered by time, yet chilling in its permanence. He stopped breathing for a moment, then dialed the sheriff's office with shaking fingers. Within hours, the quiet riverside became a sealed crime scene. Yellow tape flapped in the prairie wind. Floodlights rose against the dusk, illuminating a place that had held its secret for 15 years. Forensic teams arrived, moving with solemn precision. They unearthed bone after bone, fragile and scattered across a small radius as though shallowly buried and gradually disturbed by the seasons. Then came the discovery that turned silence into grief. A decayed women's jacket, its fibers rotted but still recognizable. And in one pocket lay a necklace, a silver chain, a small pendant in the shape of the letter E. Eights. You can almost feel the necklace in your hand, cold, delicate, intimate. For Emily's mother, it wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of her daughter's soul. She had given Emily that pendant for her 18th birthday, and Emily wore it everywhere. To see it emerge from the soil was both devastating and undeniable. Emily had been here, and she had never left. DNA testing began immediately. Bone fragments were compared with blood samples preserved from her mother. Weeks of anticipation followed until the report came back conclusive. A 100% match. After 15 years, Emily Hartman was no longer missing. She was confirmed dead. The announcement pierced Sioux Falls like a storm. Headlines screamed across South Dakota. Remains found by Big Sioux confirmed as Emily Hartman. The Hartman family, after years of limbo, finally had an answer. Her father's statement was brief but searing. "My daughter has come home." Her mother clutched the return necklace, whispering, "At least now, she's not out there alone." Eights. Yet the bones spoke more than just identity. They told of violence. Forensic pathologists examined fractures across Emily's ribs, a shattered jaw, and a forearm showing defensive wounds. She had fought. She had resisted. The evidence was clear. This was not an accident, not a disappearance by choice. It was homicide. The shallow burial added to the picture. Whoever placed her there hadn't planned carefully. It was hurried, desperate. Had the farmer not cleared that precise patch of land in 2020, her remains might have lain hidden for decades more. The case, once suspended in ambiguity, had shifted forever. Emily was no longer a missing person. She was the victim of murder. At the burial site, investigators found something else. A fragment of dark denim embedded in the soil near the bones. Weathered, frayed, but distinctively male. Under the microscope, forensic technicians noted tears consistent with a struggle. It was carefully sealed for DNA testing. This small shred of fabric would become the thread that unraveled the silence. For the Hartman family, standing by the river as experts worked, grief mingled with bitter vindication. For years, they had begged authorities to search this area more thoroughly, especially after the 2005 phone ping. Now, the evidence proved they had been right. If only they had looked then, the father whispered, maybe we wouldn't have lost 15 years. Eights. But science had finally given Emily a voice. From dust and silence, the truth had begun to rise. This is why stories like Emily's must be preserved. Why they must be shared. Save and share this story, because science proves the truth in cold case files, even when decades have passed. The discovery reignited the community's memory. Candles and flowers appeared along the Big Sioux. Strangers posted tributes online. Emily deserves justice. For many, the necklace was the most haunting image, an intimate reminder of the life lost, and a symbol that the case was not over, but reborn. From here, the hunt for answers would accelerate. The denim fragment carried unknown DNA, not yet linked to anyone in national databases. But investigators believed the fabric might finally bridge the gulf between questions and justice. The river had guarded Emily's secret for 15 years. Now, the soil had spoken. And the story, once thought buried, surged back into the light. The denim fragment recovered with Emily's remains became the most valuable clue in the case. Forensic analysts extracted a degraded DNA profile from the fabric, but when compared to CODIS, the national database of known offenders, no match appeared. In many cases, that would have been the end. A dead end. But in 2020, investigators had a new tool in their arsenal: forensic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA matching, forensic genealogy doesn't wait for a criminal to already be in the system. Instead, it compares crime scene DNA to millions of profiles voluntarily submitted to public genealogy databases by people curious about their ancestry. Even distant connections, third or fourth cousins, can be enough to build a family tree back toward the suspect. The sample from the denim was sent to a private lab in Virginia, one known for solving decades-old mysteries. For months, technicians compared the unknown DNA to segments of shared genetic code across thousands of profiles. Piece by piece, a family tree began to take shape. At first, the branches were wide. Matches scattered across South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa. But gradually, the threads converged. By early 2021, genealogists had narrowed the pool to a single extended family with roots in Sioux Falls: the Price family. It was the first real name tied to the case in over 15 years. For the cold case team, it felt like opening a locked door. You might ask yourself, would you trust science to reach so far back, to map generations and pull a stranger's name from the shadows? Forensic genealogy is both extraordinary and unsettling, but in cold cases like Emily's, it has become a light in the dark. Police began methodically reviewing members of the Price family. Many were eliminated quickly by age, gender, or location. But one man stood out: Daniel Price. In 2005, he was 28 years old, strong, capable, and living less than 10 miles from where Emily disappeared. Records showed he once owned a green Ford F-150 pickup, the very type of vehicle witness Mark Ellison had reported idling behind Emily's Corolla on Interstate 90. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Daniel Price's history was marred by violence. In 2002, he had been arrested for domestic assault against his then-wife, though the charges were later dropped. Between 2004 and 2007, neighbors filed reports describing him as volatile, prone to following women around the neighborhood, even staring through windows late at night. At the time, those incidents were dismissed as eccentric, even creepy, but not criminal. In the context of Emily's disappearance, they took on a chilling new weight. Detectives gathered quietly, piecing together the pattern. Daniel's age fit. His vehicle matched. His history of aggression was undeniable. And the DNA found with Emily's remains traced directly to his bloodline. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed direct confirmation. So, they placed him under surveillance. For weeks, unmarked cars shadowed his routines. Officers collected discarded cigarette butts and beer cans from trash bins, items most people never imagined could one day betray them. Those samples were rushed to the lab. When results came back, the truth was undeniable. The DNA on the cigarette butts matched perfectly with the DNA on the denim fragment. After 16 years of silence, the circle had finally closed. For the Hartman family, learning the suspect's name was both devastating and liberating. "We just wanted to know who," Emily's mother said through tears. "Who stole her life?" The father, usually reserved, gripped his wife's hand and nodded. After years of waiting, they had a name. This is where science proves its worth beyond debate. Forensic genealogy transformed a dead end into a direct line. Without it, Daniel Price would have remained just another face in Sioux Falls, his secret buried forever by the river. Comment, "Fund the science," if you believe forensic genealogy deserves more support. Because in cold case files, it is often the only bridge between silence and justice. By the summer of 2021, investigators had enough evidence to seek an arrest warrant. Daniel Price's name, once hidden in plain sight, was now burned into the pages of Emily Hartman's case file. And with it came the possibility that, after 16 years of pain, the Hartman family might finally see justice take form. The shadow that began on Interstate 90 in 2005 was finally taking shape in the bright light of DNA science. On an overcast morning in July 2021, unmarked cruisers rolled quietly into a quiet Sioux Falls neighborhood. Detectives had waited more than 15 years for this moment. They watched Daniel Price step out of his home, coffee mug in hand, unaware that the walls of secrecy around him had finally collapsed. The command came through the radio. "Move in." "Eights." Officers swarmed. Price froze as weapons were drawn, his mug shattering on the driveway. Within seconds, he was in handcuffs, his face twisted in shock and indignation. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering as the man they had known for years as quiet but odd was pushed into the back of a squad car. The charges were clear: kidnapping and murder. But the path to conviction would require more than DNA. Investigators needed his own words, his own contradictions, to tighten the noose. Inside the sterile gray walls of the interrogation room, Daniel Price sat stiffly, arms folded, a sheen of sweat forming at his temple. Across from him, two detectives slid photographs across the table: Emily's smiling face, the silver E necklace, the denim fragment. At first, Price denied everything. He had never met Emily Hartman. He insisted. He hadn't been anywhere near Interstate 90 that night. His Ford F-150, sold years ago, he claimed, to a stranger he couldn't name. But the detectives pressed harder. They reminded him of the DNA. They reminded him of the witnesses who had seen a green pickup behind Emily's car. Price shifted in his chair. His hands twitched. Then came the cracks. He admitted he once might have stopped near the interstate that night, but insisted it was only to help a stranded motorist. He couldn't explain why his DNA was found on the denim recovered with Emily's remains. He said maybe someone else in his family had borrowed his truck. Yet earlier, he had sworn no one else ever drove it. The contradictions piled up. The detective circled back, hammering the timeline. He changed his story again, this time suggesting he had seen Emily at the gas station but never spoke to her. But the camera footage showed no such encounter. If you were on that jury, how much doubt would you need? Would you believe the DNA evidence, the witness accounts, the violent history, and still waver? Or would you hear Daniel Price's shifting stories and see them for what they were? The frantic scramble of a guilty man trying to rewrite the past. The interrogation stretched for hours. Each time Price contradicted himself, detectives tightened the net. His voice rose, then broke into whispers. He demanded a lawyer. By then, the damage was done. On tape, his conflicting statements formed a tapestry of guilt. Forensic psychologists later noted that Price exhibited classic signs of denial and projection. He spoke in half-truths, often framing his statements in the conditional. If I was there, if that was my truck. These linguistic evasions, experts explained, are common among offenders who know the evidence against them is insurmountable. Meanwhile, the Hartman family waited outside the interrogation wing, their hearts pounding. They had endured 16 years of agony, and now, finally, they wanted one thing above all: to hear the words that confirmed Daniel Price was responsible. They didn't get a confession. Price never said, "I did it." But he gave them something else. Enough contradictions to shatter any illusion of innocence. The arrest was announced publicly that evening. Cameras flashed as the sheriff declared, "We believe we have the man responsible for the abduction and murder of Emily Hartman." For the first time in years, the Hartman family allowed themselves a fragile breath of relief. But relief was tempered with caution. Trials are battlegrounds, and juries can be unpredictable. Would the DNA, the denim, the pickup, and the interrogation tapes be enough? Or would Daniel Price's refusal to confess plant seeds of doubt in the minds of 12 strangers? The public, too, was split. Some saw the mountain of evidence as undeniable. Others, wary of cases built on forensics alone, wondered if prosecutors could truly seal the deal. That tension, the thin line between guilt and reasonable doubt, would soon dominate the courtroom. Chat guilties, or reasonable doubt. What do you see in Daniel Price's words? In cold case files like this, your judgment mirrors the jury's burden, and justice hangs on that razor's edge. The trial of Daniel Price began in the fall of 2022, nearly 17 years after Emily's disappearance. For the Hartman family, walking into that courtroom was both unbearable and necessary. They sat only a few feet from the man they believed had stolen their daughter, clutching tissues in each other's hands as testimony began. The prosecution built its case meticulously. First came the science. DNA lifted from the denim fragment matched Price with astronomical certainty. Experts explained the chain of custody, the rigorous testing, and how the probability of the DNA belonging to anyone else was less than 1 in a trillion. Jurors studied the charts, their eyes narrowing as the data unfolded. Then came the witnesses. Truck driver Mark Ellison recounted what he had seen that night in 2005. The silver Corolla on the shoulder, a green pickup idling behind it. He pointed directly to Daniel Price, declaring, "That was the kind of truck I saw." Neighbors testified about Price's violent temper and history of stalking behavior. And the detectives played interrogation footage, highlighting every contradiction in Price's story. The defense countered with its only viable argument: contamination. Attorneys argued that the denim fragment had been buried in soil for years, exposed to weather and animals. How, they asked, could anyone be certain that DNA hadn't been transferred later, unintentionally? They tried to sow doubt, pointing out every procedural misstep from the early days of the investigation. But the prosecution struck back, reminding jurors that contamination doesn't create perfect matches. DNA doesn't just appear out of thin air, the prosecutor said. It was there because Daniel Price was there. 8. The jury deliberated for 6 tense hours. The Hartman family waited in silence, every tick of the clock a hammer against their nerves. Finally, the foreman returned, holding the verdict slip. On the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant, Daniel Price, guilty. A's! A cry escaped Emily's mother as her husband wrapped his arms around her. Price's face twisted in rage, then slumped into resignation. The judge's sentence was swift. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. No freedom, no second chance. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Hartman family could breathe, knowing the man who haunted their lives would never walk free again. It wasn't closure, because nothing could bring Emily back. But it was justice. And justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. The verdict did not close the wound, but it gave Emily's family in Sioux Falls a way forward. Along the Big Sioux River, a memorial of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes rose where her remains were found. At the University of South Dakota, the Emily Hartman Scholarship now helps young women pursue dreams she never lived to fulfill. Her name endures not as a missing person, but as a symbol of resilience. This case reminds us of how devastating early investigative errors can be, how fragile trust becomes when leads are ignored. Yet it also proves the strength of modern DNA and forensic genealogy, and the unyielding persistence of a family who refused to let their daughter's story fade. Emily Hartman's voice was silenced in 2005, but through justice and legacy, she speaks still. Subscribe and share to follow more cold case files that deserve the light.